Welcome to Igniting Change, the podcast where we explore innovation, industry trends, and how tech for good is solving the world's biggest challenges. Let's get into it.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Igniting Change. I'm joined today by Amina Hersi, who is the Head of Gender Rights and Justice at Oxfam International. So thank you so much for joining us today, Amina. So this is a special International Women's Day episode. So it's International Women's Day on the 8th of March. And this year is also an important year because it marks the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration, which we're going to talk about in a moment. Amina, I think it's fair to say we're in unprecedented times, and a lot has happened in the last year since we spoke. Can't quite believe it's been a year. I think today's conversation is going to be really important to highlight the realities of the current climate, but also how to build the global feminist solidarity to try to counter it. So yeah, thank you so much for joining today. I'm going to go right in. So as we near 30 years for the Beijing Declaration, what are your reflections on the gains and progress made by it, and the reasons for these successes, if any?
Hi, I'm so happy and privileged to be here again. I can't actually believe it is 1 year. I'm excited, really happy to be talking about things that I'm really passionate about. So thank you for having me back onto the podcast. So Beijing Declaration, and there's a longer sentence for it, but I'm just going to refer to it as Beijing Declaration. It was a landmark event for the progress of gender justice. This declaration was at a time hailed as the most progressive blueprint for setting global norms on the advancement of women's rights as we know them today. It was when the political, it was made, it was when the moment governments declared openly their political commitments towards making the world more equal under the laws and policies, but also I think what is different was tackling the practices that inhibited gender equality. I remember I was young at that age. I think it was 6 years old, but there was so much excitement all around the conference. In Africa, Beverly Palesa Ditsi became the first African lesbian woman to address the United Nations about LGBTQI rights. And in her speech, she said, "I urge you to make this a conference for all women, regardless of their sexual orientation, and to recognize the inalienable and indivisible human rights." So when you see the slogans around women's rights or human rights, or even now, as we call them, the SDG 5s, the Sustainable Development Goals 5, around gender equality, you can see that they both have their origins to the Beijing Declaration.
Wow.
And what made Beijing so unique was the inclusivity. Like, I don't think we have seen, even today, a space where about 30,000 activists and 17,000 officials coming together to decide a global agenda. It was more difficult to imagine, like, I can't even picture it right now, with all the different conferences that we have on different issues. We haven't achieved that level of inclusivity in the democratic exercise. And you can see that in its, progressive language, the translation directly to the Beijing Declaration. And we cannot thank enough all the feminist comrades who mobilized for this, to happen back then.
Yeah.
And I think you will remember this did not happen, in the time of globalization, or this happened before the internet or the smartphone era.
Yeah.
And about 189 countries unanimously adopted the declaration. So I just wanted to give that historic background, because it really is transcendent and did set expectations and goals for many of us. And then the thing that we would really just highlight in terms of, there's notable progress on laws, on regulations, in all the 12 areas that were mentioned within the declaration itself, from the rights of the girl child to women in power, to human rights, but also women in environment, the media, and also gender-based violence. So, for example, the year before the ratification of the Beijing Declaration, around 12 countries had laws to prosecute domestic violence. But since 1958, I mean, since not 1958, 1995, this
Yeah.
number has grown substantially with over 1,583 legislations across 193 countries targeting domestic violence. And we've also seen improvement on aspects around maternal mortality rates in many countries, and many states are also recognizing or decriminalizing LGBTQI rights. So there is progress,
Yeah.
but even as we, gear up for the commemoration 30 years,
Mm.
later, with a 6-year deadline to the Sustainable Development Goals,
Yeah.
we are unfortunately commemorating 30 years of slow, unfulfilled, and broken promises. Not a single area of those areas of concerns have been realized. Not a single indicator under SDG Goal 5 on gender equality has been fully achieved. And in fact, with the rise in populism or anti rights movements that are actively coordinating the rollback of established global norms on human rights in particular, including gender justice,
Mm.
we are seeing our leaders either playing lip service instead of implementing their commitments, or introducing really regressive and
Yeah.
cruel policies which are using gender justice as political pawns, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's hard, isn't it? Because I think, like you say, you want to acknowledge how important it was at the time, and there has been progress. So it's not to say that it's a complete kind of wash, but I think it is really important to acknowledge that I think Oxfam's referring to the period as the 30 years of broken promises, and it's not enough to have progress. It's not enough to say, well, it's better. It's like, well, no, if we laid out these sort of goals and things that we wanted to achieve, it's not good enough to just say, well, it's not as bad as it. And I think in some cases, like you say, there is regression happening now. So what might have been better is now at risk of regressing, or potentially, I mean, even getting worse, which is horrendous. So I think it's incredible that there was the successes. This might be a stupid question, so apologies if it is. Is there a plan for another declaration? So if we're coming to the end of or we're at the 30-year mark, is there a plan to revisit it, or is it just carry on?
So this year at CSW, they are going to review the declaration, and governments are going to adopt a political declaration,
Yeah.
happening on the 10th of March during the Commission on the Status of Women. And Oxfam is actually going to be there as well, listening carefully to what they say.
I can imagine, because I think you mentioned about the SDGs, and that's the 2030 deadline, right? That's
Yes.
coming up. So that's not far away either. So I guess that's going to be another point in time where you can look at things and go, right, okay, well, what do we need to do? Does there need to be a new declaration? Because it feels like it's not enough to just, it's good to mark that it's been 30 years and that's important, but to just sort of say, well, we're 30 years on and we've made a bit of progress, but we've not quite got there, isn't great. And then I think the SDGs, from everything that I've heard and people that I've spoken to from different UN organizations, it doesn't sound like come 2030 everything's going to be met unless there's some kind of supersonic progress in the next 5 years. But I think even then, um, it's unlikely, to say the best, which I think must be really hard. And I think in the work that you do, that must be quite a difficult thing to take on, because to see not only us not meeting goals but also regressing is a real I guess could be demotivating. So I guess it's important that we do look for where there has been progress to avoid complete sort of demotivation. But I mean, can you tell us a bit about how the world leaders have failed despite the commitments that were made, and the effect on women, trans people, and non-binary people?
Yeah. And it is sometimes very demotivating, exactly what you were reflecting. But we find hope. We find hope in the in our solidarity with each other, and but also trying to make sure that we continuously hold governments accountable. And I think that's what keeps us going, is that it's not just rhetoric, like we are going to hold you accountable for your commitments. But before we start, you know, we speak about the women's rights and the obligations around, member states. I just want to be very clear that we are not asking for charity or goodwill, right? Like, we are demanding our rights, we are demanding equality, we are ultimately asking for justice.
Mm.
So, while human rights and dignity cannot be quantified, I just want to paint a picture of what it actually means and how this failure stem from years of deeply exploitative and extractive systems of oppression, rising inequality. And I'll just pick two areas of concern within the Beijing platform and the declaration to illustrate this. So women in poverty and women and the economy. Um, Oxfam really analyzed that we are living in a world where 252 men have more wealth than all 1 billion women and girls in Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean combined.
Oof,
And
that
in
is,
2024, the total billionaire wealth increased by 2 trillion US dollars. That is equivalent to an increase of 2 million every single day for each billionaire. Meanwhile, the number of people living in poverty has barely changed since 1990. And it's this unequal access to incomes and opportunities that creates not just unjust societies, but it actually kills people.
yeah,
So we found that inequality contributes to the death of at least one person every 4 seconds.
that is,
That's one, two, three, four, just that. And someone else is dying because of inequality. And
that,
with women and girls and racialized groups who are often disproportionate and impacted by this, even though we know that they're the ones sustaining the world economy, subsidizing their labor through unpaid or underpaid care, right? So the last time we tried to quantify what this unpaid labor is was that each day women contribute to an estimate 12.5 billion actually hours of unpaid care work that is not recognized or valued in the current economic systems.
yeah, I can believe that. Unfortunately,
So,
absolutely believe that. I mean, the numbers are just staggering, aren't they? It's almost sort of beyond comprehension when you're sort of saying 2 million a day per billionaire. And then with 4 seconds, it's just not really kind
but
of
it's but
possible.
that's the problem. Like, I think it's also it's being sustained by the systems
Mm,
that we are holding on to, right? For the past 3 decades, the idea of the heterosexual nuclear family or natural family persists,
yeah.
upholding this gendered and racist economic system, right?
Mm,
That further entrenches not just patriarchal gender roles where, waged or valued labor is undertaken by men outside the home, while unpaid domestic labor continues to be taken disproportionately by
yeah.
women inside the home, undermining all the attempts to achieve gender justice. And for those who are in the labor market, so for women and non binary people and LGBTQI people who are in the labor markets, we know too well the disparity in the
Mm,
inequality. So the persistent gender pay gap, the violence and discrimination to date, where 1 in 3 people around the world are facing sexual violence, and 1 in 3 women, so 1.3 billion women, live in countries that do not prohibit the dismissal of pregnant women workers. And you have countries like Singapore or Canada, for instance, who put measures of control around bodily autonomy built
mm,
into permits given to migrant domestic workers, for example. So for any worker who becomes pregnant must either seek an abortion or be deported. Yet,
yes.
40% of those women of reproductive ages live in countries where access to abortion is restricted. We have about 753 million women of reproductive age not being able to access basic human rights. But I could go on and on, and it's a grim picture across the board. If we were just to unpack any of the other 12 areas of concerns.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it is just horrendous, and presumably with the current climate, and with the global gag rule and order, like that's gonna get worse because it's restricting women even further. And like you say, it's so much more than just the bodily autonomy, because then it's your financial autonomy as well, and then that is kind of everything, right? If you take away people's bodily autonomy and their financial autonomy, it's pretty much your freedom wrapped up in one thing. So I don't know if you have any thoughts or on that side of things.
Yeah, I think the reinstatement of the global gag rule is a devastating blow to global health and women's rights because it will deepen inequality and endanger lives. Like, I think the fact that we are forcing healthcare providers to choose between much needed funding and offering comprehensive care, including abortion, care, is effectively, cutting services to millions of people, in particular women and girls in low income countries. And it's we have to condemn, we have to really really push back on this cruel and regressive policy that is ultimately using women's health and as political pawns. That's essentially what is happening, and we must advocate for the repeal of the global gag rule. Simple, really, like, that's it. you
Yeah,
know
it is just insane because it's taking a health issue, and I think we talked about this before. It's a medical issue and turning it into, like, say, a political one. It's just it is really horrendous to watch, and there's so much evidence of that, how conflated the morality has become with it, because you see sort of conversations happening in the States about it, when you look at the abortion ban in the different states, and people talking about exceptions and saying there shouldn't be any exceptions. But then, there was a horrendous case of, I think it was a 10-year-old girl who became pregnant, and someone did an abortion for her, and they were saying, oh, well, that doesn't count, that's an exception, because we wouldn't consider that an abortion. And that's a medical term. What that poor girl went through was a medical procedure, but they're conflating it with the morality, and that's just so impossibly dangerous, because that shouldn't be how politics is run anyway. But apart from anything else, that is endangering health and, like we said before, the freedom, the financial freedom, the bodily autonomy of women. And I do despair a little bit of this one in particular, just because I do think it's one of those that there isn't an equal and equivalent thing that you can compare with men, where there's something that is like a medical health right that is at risk for men. And it is a really, really frustrating and quite frankly terrifying one, because we've seen, and history tells us, things that happen in one part of the world then trickles down, because when people see that it works for their agenda, they will then take that and kind of apply it in different areas of the globe. And I think that is, pretty horrendous, to be honest. I think it's just, it is. I remember our conversation last year and kind of feeling really sort of kind of angry while I talked about it. And it's so lovely that you're so lovely, because it calms me and soothes me a bit. But yeah, it is. It's really, really kind of troubling, and the effect on, and I think we were sort of saying before about this is obviously affecting women, but it's also affecting trans and non-binary people. I think from everything I've read, the global gag rule, it seems to be extending its reach as well. That's what's so it's not just women's health that is kind of being affected. It will also affect sort of LGBTQ people as well, in terms of their, again, medical treatment, not anything other than health. So yeah, it does feel like the effect is going to be terrible and even wider than it has been in previous years since it's been in effect. So that's not great.
the
So
applying of anti-right, essentially it's really the applying of exceptionalism to rights-based issues, right? Like, where's who, who has the right, and where's the start and stop of that? And unfortunately, this is being played out across the world right now, as we're seeing. I don't think it's unique to the US. It's across the board for sure.
Yeah, it's like you say, it's happening everywhere. It's just, yeah, it's a tough one to watch. And I think because you mentioned about the sort of the two areas of poverty and economy, I think the problem with the economy piece is that often when you talk about sort of funding for women's rights, and it's kind of people think that it's sort of like handouts, and it's like, oh, we just want a fund to be able to do this one thing, and that's not the case. It's kind of the money to actually sort of put your money where your mouth is and support women, and make sure that there is money going into the systems that affect kind of women's finances and the economy in total. In terms of on the thing of funding, so the funding for anti-rights and anti-gender movements, particularly in and from the global north, is kind of feels like a main sort of culprit. What are your kind of insights about it, and can you tell us the extent of it?
So the anti-rights movements are not actors operating on the fringes of society anymore. I think they have captured the very institutions meant to protect people's rights. And we see them running governments, corporations, the media, academia, think tanks, and even gaining access to negotiate in multilateral engagements, including in the UN.
Yeah.
They are trying to mainstream this through the co-optation of human rights and anti-colonial languages. So, for example, what we were just discussing, the anti-abortion, even though, gag rule is in the US, there's one happening within the UN system called the non-binding Geneva Consensus Declaration. And this is a document in a style of an international treaty that claims commitments for protecting women's health and strengthening the family. And it so far has about 42 signatory countries.
Wow.
And this is essentially same thing of we are trying in the vein of protecting families, and very specifically here heterosexual families, completely goes against bodily autonomy and the right to have an abortion, safe abortions. So this political will or consensus on women's rights is like we had in the 90s, has not just eroded the overnight in a vacuum. It's highly organized, well-funded anti-rights groups that are right-wing and ultra-conservative,
Yeah.
holding the beliefs of rooted, colonial, patriarchal doctrine. And one of those enabling factors is the dismantling of gender justice commitments. For us, that's how we see it. And it's no surprise that governments captured by them are launching assaults to the rights of women, girls, and non binary people. So, like, this has implications on the quality and the quantity of funding that we're seeing on gender equality. The total official development assistance, ODA, that is meant to enhance the effectiveness, influence, and sustainability of women's rights organizations. If we were to compare the drop of that, in 2022 was about 432 million, and that's without what went to the public sector institutions, for example, ministries of gender or gender equality or women. And according to the Global Philanthropy Project, just 3 anti-LGBTQI organizations received funding in 2021, 2022, than all 8,000 LGBTQI organizations globally at the same period. So if we do the comparisons of what's going to women's rights organizations, what's going to LGBTQI groups, organizations across the world, from governments and other, philanthropies, we are seeing such a huge disparity. And we know that ODA is just a very small part of that much wider macroeconomic picture. Debt is a key factor that drives gender inequality. And more than half of the country is spending, more than a quarter of their revenues on debt servicing, provide little or no social protection for women, mothers, or newborn babies, So, like, feminist and queer rights organizations, despite the abysmal budgets, have been at the forefront of resisting. They still have, the like every single time bring this up, highlight these issues, and many of these groups, have their origins in rich elite from the global north.
Yeah.
Are often backed by governments as well. In Europe, the socioeconomic elites also form an important part of the anti gender and related alt right, far right funding landscape. I think one study found that at least 60 European elites, and if you can categorize them, high net worth individuals and corporations, commonly known as the one percenters, are funding many of the anti-rights organizations that are working globally. So these groups hold really violent and regressive beliefs on gender justice, on climate justice, on economic justice. So we really have to be careful, and we really have to be attuned to the realities that those with money are essentially holding and capturing not just the economic systems, but also fundamentally our democratic institutions. And it's leaving very many of us feeling alienated or excluded, and yeah, disillusioned by everything that's it's currently happening right now.
Yeah. And I think also kind of scared for how much worse it can get. It feels like the limit doesn't exist anymore in terms of what
Absolutely.
could go wrong. Because, there's been so much that's happened over the last few years that you just, unprecedented things that have happened that you would never have expected to roll back. I think, COVID, in terms of how that affected women's rights and the kind of the economic side as well, I think was horrendous, and I imagine people are still massively recovering from that. I think when you're talking about the sort of alt-right, the violence, the way that people are kind of openly playing now about this, I think is just insane. I think how open people seem to feel they can be about these things is just I don't know if that's just like a slow slide of culture. Every time someone says something a bit outrageous, it's kind of accepted, and then you just have this degradation of what is normal and acceptable is just kind of insane. I think there's a lot of insidious stuff going on as well. So I think as well as people being very open, there's also, when you said about the protecting the family, that side of things I think is particularly on social media, the kind of things that you see happening on there. So the kind of younger girls and the generation seeing what they're seeing as normalized, and what and young boys as well, what they're seeing. I've got a 9-year-old boy, and I dread to think what he will see on social media that is like, oh, that's acceptable. There seems to be a horrible amount on there around kind of propaganda of women, where people are going back to the good old days, back to the sort of traditional ways of raising a family, and saying, the women's rights movements was just propaganda to take away from how things should be. And that kind of makes me despair as someone who doesn't fit into that kind of normal family structure. It's just myself and my son. I just think it's just so insidious, and what it's doing to young kids, I just, kind of dread to think, and how that could get worse and worse. And I think as well, the sort of polycrisis element, I think massively feeds into all of this, and that ties in with the things that you're talking about around the economy and the funding, because I think when there is polycrisis happening, which was a phrase that you taught me last year, that where there's so much going wrong in the world in terms of in terms of conflict, in terms of the environment, in terms of gender rights, that funding, the sort of particularly private funding, becomes even more important, because there just isn't enough money and donor dollars and formal grants to go around to deal with the amount of crises happening. So then you do rely on private funding. So when that private funding is coming from the alt-right and going into these violent movements, you can see why there is that kind of rise, because they're the ones that are getting the money, and then compounded by the fact that the cuts are happening in areas that do affect kind of women and more marginalized groups. It's not a great picture from an economic perspective, and everything does kind of stem from that, I think, because as much as you can have grassroots organizations and people fighting the fight, ultimately, unfortunately, money makes the difference, because that's what keeps them going. So yeah, not great. It's not ideal I think the economic side of it is so important. And I think, at last International Women's Day, the theme was around sort of funding and making sure that money was going in. And I don't know how effective it was. I'd like to think it made a bit of a difference, but it doesn't feel, the net result doesn't feel like that we're saying now, and loads of organizations got loads of money last year, and that's made a load of difference.
We're
So
seeing less, actually, unfortunately.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think that it is really tough, and I the spread of disinformation, I think, is absolutely terrifying, and I think the extent of how much more change will happen in coming years, I think, is really worrying to women on a sort of individual basis and globally. Like you said, it's kind of, I know I'm prone to focusing on the north, but it is happening globally, and we do need to remember that, because it's so important to know that this is such a widespread issue, which makes it kind of even worse.
Yeah.
So I mean, and on that global scale, what can you talk to us about what the sort of political response to these horrible developments has been, and how the feminist movements are still pushing for progress even under these oppressive conditions? Because it would be good to know that there's still movement.
There is movement. There is, yeah, millions of, feminists mobilizing. I think just like 30 years ago, we are seeing, feminist movements continuing to resist anti-rights actions under the most dangerous conditions. And this is despite the little to no support, from governments. I think it's actually the feminists who, have been the biggest champion of sustaining the Beijing platform for action. And the results, I think, for me, have been remarkable. Like, the laws and regulations have no meaning without grassroots actions, and the real space to implement this was created by feminists, in my opinion, my humble opinion. It's important to celebrate this, because most recently we saw the collision, for example, of feminists in Gambia, successfully defeating attempts on religious conservatives to dilute the law against female genital mutilation. And this was just in 2024. Meanwhile, in Ghana, collective action on SRA child led to the inclusion of long-term contraceptives, since January 2022. And Sierra Leone is literally in the process about to abolish a colonial era law that criminalized abortion. So I think the fight is still going. We need to learn from Latin America, who used the legal system to decriminalize abortion, in Mexico, Argentina, Colombia. In 2020, same-sex acts were decriminalized in 133 countries. And at the same time, we are seeing a weird, or not so weird for many of us, but where the global north leaders are pushing for more divided world. And the hope is actually coming from the global south, from feminists, from the movements that have been mostly, disenfranchised and marginalized for many, many centuries. And the learning for me, I think, is very clear. Feminist movements push for a better and more equal and just future. And governments need to align with this, not the other way around anymore, right? Governments need to align with progressive movements, which are creating and envisioning boldly shared prosperity and dignity for all, and not just the divide and harm rhetoric or promoting extractive and exploitative tactics. We are seeing that doesn't work. Exactly that, what you were mentioning earlier. We're seeing the unequal systems on economics, on militarization, on gender justice, on environmental, every single aspect of it. It's crumbling. So they need to stop doing the same thing over and over again, expecting something different, right? We need to not only recognize feminist, queer, and other social justice grassroots movements for their leadership, but we also need to redress and remedy the power imbalances that continue to oppress them and exclude them from decision-making spaces. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's amazing to hear that there is that progress happening in the global south, and I think it's really important to, think about that and kind of
Hold
cling
on to that.
see that there is that progress, because I think it is easy to, and to see what's happening in the north and be, like you said, sort of disillusioned, but to know that there is still movement in the south, I think that's really kind of inspiring. And I think I always think it's a bit of a double-edged thing where when you hear those things and I think, oh my God, that's incredible that they're doing that. And then you think about what is actually being granted and you think that is so basic. That is just baseline safety. That isn't like some incredible, like, wow, we're going to really, it's not equity. It's not saying, right, we're going to redress this horrendous imbalance that has happened for centuries by putting women ahead for a while just to
No.
equity. It's kind of barely equality. But it is important, I think, to remember it, because I think it is, and to talk about it and to be aware of it, because I think it does make such a difference to see that is happening. And I think the key is, like you say, it's using the laws and using the governments, rather than just, as incredible as the grassroots organizations are when they're doing the sort of the work that they're doing on the ground. I think that's amazing, but there's only so much that you can expect individuals to do, and then it has to go to government level. It has to become legal and be part of sort of the laws, because otherwise you are depending on individuals who are probably getting a bit tired at this point, and especially when there are regressions and you kind of things are rolling backwards, you can't expect people to keep picking themselves back up and keep fighting without any kind of progress and recognition, I think, from governments to say this is really important, and it's important enough that we're not just going to give a one-off fund to help someone over there and help in a little community. It's no, we're going to write this into law because we recognize that this actually is really, really important. So I think that's good to be aware of, and I think to keep talking about those, I think is a really important thing as feminists that we can do. And obviously this is literally your job, so I think it's amazing. But for anyone that's listening, and for myself as well, where it isn't necessarily my job, it's something I feel very passionate about, to kind of spread that information, to both give the inspiration, but also as a bit of a shocking reminder of, like, this is what we're dealing with. This is the level of basic safety for women that we're talking about. And so sort of on a similar kind of theme to that, so what can we learn from feminist movements, and how can we derive more hope from them? Come on, Amina.
Okay, let's do this. I think what we can learn, and I'm gonna be quite blunt here. Like, I think feminist movements and grassroots movements have and are holding the mirror up to the world, showing the double standards and hypocrisy of the top-down global policies and norms imposed by the global north to the global south, and the institutional and structural racism that upholds almost whiteness as a norm. And the ability, this is where the hope comes from, the ability of feminists to assemble diverse coalitions and weave tapestry of alternatives to this really patriarchal and colonial system is something that we definitely need to learn from them. I think the recent, successes that I've mentioned, but there's so much more, obviously. Before the feminist movements, were based on the collisions, partnerships, and uniting in solidarity. These collisions are much needed right now, more than anything. And for me, I think where we derive hope is in uniting in solidarity, especially now, when it's clear that states have broken their promises on gender equality and ultimately broken their social contract to us as people, um, as the ones who elected them to represent our needs, in particular. But I do want to share, I think, in the vein of just recognizing amazing feminists from the different aspects, and their work. I want to highlight a small excerpt from an open letter penned by my comrades in Kenya. They're called Feminists in Kenya. It's a collective, of feminists who are based and live in Kenya. Um, and it says, "Dear feminists, fascism is here, and we have met it before. We know its patterns, its tactics, its violence. It weaponizes despair, it banks on our exhaustion, it divides and attempts to rule. It feeds on isolation, hoping that we stand alone. But we have never fought alone. The people who value humanity are more than the people who don't. We will fight across borders, across histories, across struggles, from the occupied territories to the refugee camps, to the streets, to our very homes. We have always known what it means to collectively resist. And so we move, not in fear, but in feminist boldness." For me, that is the hope. And I take it word for word verbatim because every time I read this expert, I get really, really energized again. So, yes, a message from feminists in Kenya.
But absolutely incredible. I think that's very amazing. Of course, made me a bit emotional. Yeah, that's just absolutely incredible, and I think so important. And touches on the stuff we talked about moments ago, where it is the exhaustion and all the rest of it. So even just in that of knowing that that's kind of the collective feeling, I think that's really important. So
Yes.
that's amazing, and I think ties in nicely with the theme for International Women's Day this year of for all women and girls, rights, equality, and empowerment. I think kind of that, like you said, the solidarity is the most important thing at the moment, and kind of putting everything else almost to one side and just saying like this is the kind of the common goal, that we have to recognize. And I think that's so powerful, the thing of we've seen it before, because I think that's
Exactly.
a big part of the despair of going, Christ, not again. But I think that there can be power from that in going, we've
We fought it and we won, and we we saw a better side, right? Like,
exactly. So the hope being that we can get to a better side again. So yeah, but amazing. That's an absolutely incredible quote. I think I'm going to get on a t-shirt or something. I feel like I need to get that printed out and have it just to look at on a regular basis. Like I say, it's a really energizing and powerful quote. So I think I'm not going to try and top anything after you've said that. I think that's got to be our ending statement. So Amina, thank you so much for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure again to talk to you, and I'd love for us to talk again at some point, maybe after
yes.
to hear any updates. But yeah, thank you so much for your time today, and for everything that you do. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me again.